To start us off on our Advocacy 101, I'd like to introduce Mr. Andrew Scott from BMS. Andrew's work focuses on hematology and oncology, and he prioritizes mutual value creation, thinking of health systems holistically, and collaborating with diverse stakeholders to advance public policy that improves patient access, affordability, and protects innovation. You could read the rest of his bio in the brochure.
Oh, this one down here. Okay. Okay, great. Awesome. Hi, everyone. Again, my name is Andrew Scott from Bristol Myers Squibb. And while we're pulling my slides up here, I just will kind of get started with some early thoughts. Really exciting. You guys are going on your first advocacy day. I know some of you may have experience advocating on Capitol Hill before, and some of you may not. That's okay. I think hopefully this little 101 guide that I'll walk through momentarily here will give some kind of tips, tricks, and tools. But before I get into that, I really want to say, and I think that video we just watched kind of highlights that, is that it's important to remember that each of you are the experts, right? Each of you are the experts of your story, your experience, and your kind of a critical voice going into these Hill meetings that you will have tomorrow. So it's important to kind of remind yourselves of that. You know, it's going to be, I know it can be a little, I used to actually work at I'm with obviously Bristol Myers Squibb now, but used to work at an advocacy organization focused on liver cancer. And I know many of our advocates were worried. You know, it's a little jitters, first time doing it. But again, remind yourselves this is your story. This is your time to tell it. And they will listen when you go into those Hill meetings. So I really want to kind of reiterate that throughout this presentation as we're waiting for these slides to come up. And really, a lot of this stuff that I'll go through momentarily here, we'll do a little government 101 as well. We'll also kind of talk about how to establish your messaging plan and kind of building all of that out. And hopefully we can get them to work here, these slides. But we'll talk a little bit about how to establish your kind of plan so that you feel organized. Obviously, as these meetings go, you'll get more comfortable as you go. So you'll get kind of your elevator pitch down. You'll come out of your your first advocacy day feeling like a pro, which will help a ton as well. And then we'll close with kind of do's and don'ts of this kind of advocacy day. There's certain things that, you know, obviously if you kind of follow the guide, it'll just make it easier and make it even more comfortable for you. So if we can go to perfect. Okay. So I want to be cognizant of time too, but I also want to say that if you have a question, don't hesitate to raise your hand. Obviously, there'll be an opportunity to ask maybe some questions at the end as well. But as what I'm always happy to pause. I really want to make this a fun experience here. You know, you're going to be talking about your lived experiences, and it's going to be shaping policy. And that I think is an exciting process here. Your voice matters, as I mentioned earlier. So as I already kind of alluded to, we're going to be talking a little bit about that kind of government 101 to start. We'll then get into kind of developing your plan, your advocacy plan, mapping things out. So I mentioned kind of talking through things, working with each other will help as well, because then you're going to go into these meetings and you're going to kind of have a plan of attack that will really make this as, fun and easy of a process at all. And then we'll finally get into the do's and don'ts of advocacy. So I'll also mention too that I'm going to hit a lot of stuff that's kind of broader than just your Hill Day tomorrow. I think an important theme as well is that advocacy, policy work, all of that takes time. It takes your initial meeting, your initial sharing of your story. Then it's going to take follow up. It's going to take kind of pinging those legislative staffers and more tomorrow, reminding them of your ask, whether it's the screening ask or whatever it might be. It's going to require that follow up, and then eventually you'll see some movement, and it's still going to take time. So I think that's an important thing that I'll walk through briefly as well when I'm talking about other ways to advocate outside of being here in Washington, D.C., which there are a lot of ways to do it. So first, we're going to kind of talk about just general government 101, advocacy 101 to start us off here. Advocacy definition. I won't go through all of these details here, but really I just want to say that many of you have advocated before, whether you've come here to Washington and advocated in a policy sense, or you've advocated in your community, or you've advocated in your family for whatever it might be, changing, moving the day of a family get together or whatever it might be. You already have experience advocating, building, kind of establishing in your mind a messaging plan, what you are hoping to achieve, and then having that ask, right? You've done all this before. Now we're just doing it in a new setting here on Capitol Hill. So there are the three types of kind of government advocacy as well. Of course, you have your local and community advocacy, your state advocacy, and your federal advocacy that you all will be doing tomorrow. I think it's also important to understand, too, when I'm talking about time, you're going to see movement kind of decrease as you go to federal government as well, too. I think that's an important factor to keep in mind. Local is where you will see some change quicker. And I think that's also important to keep in mind too, is that it's part of this advocacy is don't hold yourself only to Capitol Hill. I mean, it's a huge part of it, right? The federal government is critical in some of these system level changes, but it is not the only option when you're talking about, I'm just brainstorming here, but an awareness day for stomach cancer or whatever it might be, you can get that in your own city, your own, whatever it might be at the local level, in your city hall, town hall. There are opportunities there as well. So very briefly, again, I won't go through all of this. I'm happy to share the slides, but being cognizant of time, this is really kind of your legislative process. If any of you watched that old video of how a bill becomes a law, this kind of walks through that very briefly there, and it shows that just kind of the process of having a sponsor of a bill, then the bill is assigned to a committee. The committee holds a hearing on the bill, and then it's put on the Senate or House calendar. And then it's kind of goes through the process again so that you can have it move through both chambers of the House and Senate, and then you eventually get to a full floor vote. So it's a series of processes. This is one of the reasons why it takes so long. But again, I'm happy to share this later. But just kind of moving through some of this government 101 quickly. And then also outside of the federal legislative process, there is the regulatory advocacy as well too. So some of Aki's asks that she mentioned in that video have more of a regulatory advocacy piece to it as well. And this is when you're working with agencies like the FDA or the CDC or whoever it might be to get an awareness campaign or screening guidelines changed. This is where the regulatory advocacy piece comes into play. Obviously, I'm going to move through this quickly because tomorrow you're focused on Capitol Hill. So now I'm going to shift a little bit in that kind of developing of the messaging plan. I've talked about that a few times already, but it's going to be important. Obviously, you are the ones who know your story better than anyone else, but still having a plan of attack before you go into these meetings, kind of a order that you're going to go through, potentially communicating with any teams that you're on about who's going to speak when. Maybe they are from a certain legislative district or whatever it might be. Kind of organizing yourselves in a way will make this a lot smoother, because you will be restricted by time tomorrow. That is something that always happens, is that you will have a limited amount of minutes with most likely legislative staff. Hopefully you'll have time with the member of Congress. I'll mention this again later as well, but legislative staff are sometimes more important to meet with than the member of Congress because they're the ones who write the bill. So they are important to meet with, but they will be limited, and they will give you, the time, but at the same time you want to be organized so that you can actually get to your ask. You don't want to walk out of the meeting thinking, "Oh, I didn't get a chance to actually tell them what we want." You want them to know that. So that's where this really comes into play here, is planning your advocacy effort. Really thinking of what is your primary goal as a start, coming together as a group and understanding this is our ask. Who is the target audience? In this case, it will be legislative staff, members of Congress on Capitol Hill tomorrow. And then, I will talk a little bit more of the best way to reach them. Of course, meeting them in person tomorrow or by Zoom is a great way to do that. And then, of course, also, I mentioned earlier the follow-up plan as well, because this was going to take time. This one meeting tomorrow is not going to see your goal accomplished. So it's important to think again about how you can follow up. So we'll get into that a little bit later as well. And then also thinking of how you can collaborate, thinking of your allies here in this room, your allies in other advocacy organizations. It takes a village to move the needle on some of these bills, and it's important to have allies with you. So when we're talking about developing your message, and this is really what I was talking about earlier, is how you kind of organize yourself to make sure you go into these meetings tomorrow feeling prepared. And you're doing your research on the member that you're meeting with, the staff. I think this way it's a great way to uncover little tidbits. Potentially you might have gone to the same high school as the member of Congress or whatever it might be. It's a great way to kind of break the ice before you get into your story and what you're actually there to talk about today. Or you can talk about how, I went to a hospital in your district and I know that you've been there as well, or whatever it might be. Can be a great way to start by doing your research and ensuring that you're prepared before you go into the meeting. And then organizing your thoughts. This is what I was talking about earlier, is that the story is a critical part of this meeting tomorrow, but you want to ensure that you kind of have that elevator pitch down. You're going to be limited in time. So you want to kind of organize your thoughts, map it out. I would write it down the night before, potentially even write down your story too. Because again, you're going to think you're going to have a few minutes. And I'm sure all of you have wonderful stories that take longer than a few minutes to share. But you want to, again, ensure that you get to that ask, right? So you want to ensure that you kind of move through things in an organized fashion. If more than one of you are going to talk, kind of ensuring that you're organized, and that you're kind of both dividing and conquering. Maybe one person gets one meeting, another person gets another, or one person kind of starts things off, one person tells their story this time, and another person has the ask. So all of that, and you kind of see here, I give some examples of how you kind of organize your thoughts, maybe little kind of hooks to kind of get yourself rolling as you map out your plan. And then, of course, telling your story, the most important part of this, that will resonate with these legislators. It will. Your story is powerful, and it is the one thing that is going to, I will say a brief story about an example of advocate I worked with in the past in my former organization. He told a story about how his story of being impacted by liver cancer. And the member of Congress that we were meeting with immediately decided that he was signing on the bill right after hearing that story. And our advocate, was very nervous going into that. He had never done this before. And he's like, oh, the federal government, they're not going to listen to me. They don't care about my story. But after that, right, I mean, his confidence was through the roof. And I want to caution that too. You're not always going to get a legislator to walk out signing onto a bill, but it gives an example of the possibilities, right? And we kind of organize things in a way. You're not trying to cut your story short, but you want to just be aware of the time and aware of those kind of key inflection points that might resonate. Doing your research again, so you know maybe ahead of time what might resonate with the office. And of course, ending by making the ask. And then there are, I mentioned earlier how there will be many forums. You guys will be doing the live portion mostly tomorrow. There are, of course, virtual options as well. And this is what I'm talking about, how when you think about how this is going to take time and it's going to take consistent meetings, your first meeting tomorrow is not going to lead to that. I mean, I gave that one example that, was in a perfect situation, but it's not going to always lead to that, right? And that's where you have to think of these others. You're going to want to call the district office potentially. You're going to want to build a relationship. That's why I mentioned earlier doing the research, thinking of those connections, right? Your story will resonate, but there will be other things that connect with these legislative staffs, their members, that will allow you to stick in their memory, right? Because they will be meeting with a lot of people in a day. They go through, many of these staffers, they are covering multiple issue areas. So they're not only health, they're not only meeting with many different health advocacy organizations, they're also meeting with tax, they're meeting with energy, they're meeting with a wide range. So you got to think about what is going to cause your story to stick out in their mind. And then you're going to want to have these other examples of advocacy that you can kind of keep reminding them that you're here. And then there are the virtual options as well, social media, calling out there, doing an op-ed, press releases, and more, or other ways, that emailing them, reminding them, and more. So, I want to be cognizant of time here. I'm going to move quickly through. I've kind of talked broadly about a lot of this already. When you're thinking of a good meeting, I kind of gave a story as an example already, but really it's kind of mapping out your plan, having your goal, organizing who's saying what when, being sure that you're confident in how you tell your story in a short way, and then kind of moving through until you get to the eventual ask as well, and then of course ending the meeting. And I'll talk about this at the end as well, about the do's and don'ts of actual meetings, and that is thanking them for their time. And then a key part at the end here I'll just flag is the business cards, that you can continue doing some of those advocacy um, options that I flagged earlier. And then, again, since tomorrow is focused on the Hill Day, I'm going to kind of move through this. I'm happy to share these slides. These are some social media tips of how to potentially continue that kind of drumbeat of advocacy. So now we're going to get to the do's and don'ts. And this is really kind of an important thing to keep in mind tomorrow is when you get in there, we've mapped out the plan, you've got your ask, you've got your goal, you've practiced your story. But now it's just the small things that will ensure that these meetings go well. It's things that you might be, oh, of course, I got to introduce myself. Well, there's been situations where naturally people forget, or you forget to shake their hands, or you forget to do all, you go off topic. As another example, I mean, you feel like you're flowing, but suddenly your 15 minutes are up and you've gone off topic. So it's important to keep that in mind too. Of course, ending with the ask. I've mentioned that a few times. Telling your story, being respectful is important. I think this, and I may mention this again later as well, but it's important that this, of course, politics are involved in all of this. And I know everyone is from all across the United States, but it's important to kind of keep the politics outside of these meetings, right? We're talking policy, not politics. We're talking healthcare, health policy, but keeping the politics separate. So I think, being respectful, understanding that you're going to be meeting with both sides of the aisle tomorrow. You're going to need both sides of the aisle to accomplish your goal, right? I think in a normal, I will say, I won't get into the details of today's Congress, but in a normal Congress, both sides working together are going to accomplish things. And then some of the don'ts, I kind of talked about these already as well, but covering multiple topics, you want to stay focused on your ask. Again, thinking about the politics and policy, you don't want to argue with these members and their staff tomorrow. Again, when you're organizing yourself, just making sure, you're going to naturally miss some points. That happens. You'll get comfortable and you'll have your elevator pitch, but you want to make sure you hit at least the big points you're trying to hit. And then the follow-up is just so critical as well. So, with that, I'm going to kind of bring it, I'm happy to answer any questions anyone might has, but, we talked a little bit of the kind of government 101, establishing your plan, making sure you're organized, thinking of your story, mapping that out, talking tonight, figuring out who you're going to be in the room with, and then figuring out how you're going to organize yourselves in each of those meetings. And then we close with a little bit of the do's and don'ts of these actual Hill meetings as well. But also, again, another reminder: the follow up is going to be key. So you're going to go into these meetings, you're going to ask for the business card, you're going to take it home. You're going to email them potentially as well too, if you feel comfortable with it. You don't have to do it if you don't want to, but again, to see the actual things, these ask actually move, it's important to kind of keep that press in a respectful way. So, any questions? I'm happy to answer any. Yes.
So, are the meetings? You're saying kind of the meetings are probably like 15 minutes.
I would plan on 15 minutes, and I would also plan that these meetings could be standing in the hallway. They could be in the office and you have a nice couch to sit on and you're comfortable, or they could be walking, so it's important again to have that plan early.
How often are the legislators late? Like if they're not there when we think the meeting is, do we for a couple hours?
A couple. I mean, the meetings will happen when they happen. The staff will meet with you then. Unless it will, if the legislator can't be there, they can't be there. Sometimes, and that will happen. The staff will say, oh, so and so member of Congress got pulled into votes or whatever it might be. So they will let you know. And then you might get lucky. You might be meeting in their entry room, and then the member comes in and they're like, oh, and you can briefly say hi and and shake their hand and then continue your ask with the staff. But yeah, if the meeting's happening, it's happening at the time that they maybe 15 minutes, but that's yeah. Any other questions? Yes, in the back. Yeah. Oh, no, so I will say there are a lot of ways. This was just showing all the different ways to advocate. You do not need videos. You do not need pictures. I will say, it can help, but it's purely up to you and your story. I will say I did a meeting with another advocate that was talking about heart disease, and they had a plastic heart to talk about it. So there are other, but don't feel obligated to do that. There just tell your story, and be confident in that, and you'll be fine. You'll be all good. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, so dumb question. Are we going to get to what our ask is?
Yeah, what are these talking points?
I think Aki has them, so I also, yes, we're going through them later. Yes.
Also, a logistics question.
Yes.
Once we're in the Capitol, are we inside and can go to these buildings underground, or are we going to have to go above ground and go to multiple buildings?
So you can go underground. And I will say, as a quick preface, it's a maze. You're going to get lost, so you want to make sure you have time. If you can get there early, you want to. You can go underground. You can go above ground. If you go above ground, you'll have to go through security in each building. The security is much faster than it would be at an airport or anything like that. So it's generally quick. But if you go down to the basement level, and don't hesitate, there are no dumb questions. You can always ask people too, and they'll point you in the right direction. But if you can map that out ahead of time, and maybe you'll be getting into that a little later.
7:30 when we go over the full prepping for next tomorrow.
Yes.
Are we going as groups in to talk to some of these legislators? Or
We'll talk about that at 7:30. Yep.
Yes, I'm giving just the help for planning out your plan of attack. You guys will get those details later. Yes, one more question. I know I'm over time too, but one more question on the way back. Yeah. That's exactly right. I mean, congressperson, representative, if you're unsure, so and then the staff, you can just call them by their first name. They'll introduce you. Go ahead. Yep.
I have advocated a lot, and I have one time actual citizen any questions. So most of the time,
I'm sorry, I'm over time.
We're talking about this at 7:30. I'm sorry, we just have to get to our next presentation. And Cindy, you're actually leading our 7:30 discussion. So you are going to be able to answer all those questions that we all have.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. And we are happy to share these slides too later. Yep.